In the mystical realm where the line between myth and reality blurs, Moonlit Embrace, the Alpha's Unveiled Secret, chronicles the unexpected entanglement of Sophia, a spirited human woman, with Xavier, a cursed werewolf alpha, as they navigate a perilous journey of love, betrayal, and the quest to break an age-old enchantment. Sophia, disillusioned by failed relationships, finds solace in her quaint lakeside cottage, unaware that destiny has other plans. Xavier, burdened by his lycanthropic curse bestowed upon him by the gypsy lineage, is desperate for a cure that can restore his humanity and end his eternal torment. Their paths intertwine when Xavier seeks out Sophia, believing she holds the key to his liberation, due to her unique connection to the enigmatic portal master. Set against the backdrop of a world where werewolves coexist alongside humans, hidden in plain sight, the narrative unfolds with a blend of suspense, romance, and supernatural intrigue. Xavier's charm and gallantry, despite his cursed state, intrigues Sophia, who begins to question her skepticism about love and the supernatural. As their chemistry sizzles, they uncover a hidden history that links their families and threatens to disrupt the delicate balance of their world. Moonlit Embrace delves into the transformative power of love and acceptance, as Sophia learns to embrace her own hidden strengths and the possibility of a life intertwined with Xavier's. Together, they must confront not only the curse, but also the machinations of those who wish to exploit their union for nefarious purposes. Sophia's encounter with the wise and enigmatic Madame Murela, who holds the secrets to Xavier's past, adds a layer of mystery and potential salvation. The discovery that Xavier's curse was born from a long-forgotten act of vengeance by Murela's ancestor introduces a twist that complicates their quest and deepens the emotional stakes. As Sophia and Xavier's bond strengthens, they are faced with challenges that test their loyalty, trust, and the lengths they are willing to go for each other. The introduction of secondary characters like the alluring lawyer Braden Hollister, who stirs Sophia's interest, and the complex dynamics between werewolves and humans, enriches the narrative, creating a tapestry of relationships and intrigue. With vivid descriptions of werewolf rituals, the tension of forbidden love, and the unraveling of ancient curses, Moonlit Embrace, the Alpha's Unveiled Secret, offers a fresh and captivating twist on the classic werewolf tale. It explores themes of redemption, the complexities of identity, and the indomitable spirit of love that transcends the constraints of human and supernatural realms. This novel promises an immersive reading experience, leaving readers enchanted by its blend of romance, adventure, and the enduring hope for a love that defies even the darkest magic. Chapter 1. Justin had first met Jex when the kid was 6, small-framed with eyes dark as night. He'd stood on the other side of a dead body, pooling blood around his feet. The dead guy had been one of Jex's bodyguards, and the kid had watched calmly, while his father went into a rant about something long forgotten before he'd pulled the trigger. Jex's feet hadn't been the only thing covered in blood, but like the gore around him, he'd stood still watching chaos encircling him, a deathbringer in all his glory until he blinked at his father, turning his head slightly and in a voice so scarily soft, making a shiver work down Justin's back. Jex had wondered if it was okay for him to clean up. It hadn't been the first time Jex had watched the death of one of his father's men, and it wouldn't be the last. To Justin, it was almost as if death and pain had been so ingrained in him, he didn't know the difference. It had taken him a few years to realize the man was actually quite gentle with those he held close. For all he chose to do that for, they'd ask for nothing. Unfortunately, that spot had only one member, and Justin was looking at him. Matthew Smith. At least he was one of the many men that stood in the light flooded front yard of a huge property, tucked away from prying eyes. The house itself sat on the top of a hill, a king looking down upon his kingdom. Justin shook his head as the voices started up. A new car brought in all the clutter as two men stood off against each other. The fight was clearly a lover's spat. The body language wasn't hate but anger, and it vibrated around them with something Justin would call hurt. He couldn't make out what they were saying, and quite honestly he didn't care. Getting involved, wondering what it would be like to join them in those jokes and family feelings would only make him soft, and he couldn't allow that. Justin had watched the family a little longer than he'd ever done before. He tried to tell himself it was because he needed to find the weak link. He wanted the perfect moment to go in and take Jex, but he knew it was a lie. Just as he knew he wasn't meant to be watching one little twink who wasn't his target. Small, innocent, boy-next-door quality with big eyes and curly blonde hair. The kid's thin body was Justin's perfect match, and he gathered he'd gone way too long between fucks because whenever the little man came into view he'd not taken his eyes off him. Tossing his binoculars onto the passenger seat, Justin let his head fall back against the headrest, closing his eyes with a huge sigh. What the fuck was wrong with him? Rubbing his face, he tried his hardest to rid his mind of the little guy. Speaking of tall, he was calling someone little when he'd made his career. Riding on the anger of being small. Letting his hands drop, he fluttered his eyes open slightly, scanning. He was always scanning. It was ingrained in him as a kid. He constantly needed to know what was happening around him at all times. Something moved just inside the tree line. Ducking down a little more in his seat, he could still see through the holes in the steering wheel and yet knew whoever it was wouldn't see him. As he watched the shadow grow larger on the paved road, his eyes adjusted to the darkness. Whoever it was would show itself soon enough. The hairs along his back stood up. His gut gave a kick as it always did when the mission was about to start. However, that normally started when he was lying down on the ground with his rifle in hand, and not sitting in the car. Still on stakeout. The man came out of the trees cautiously, though clearly he wasn't afraid. Someone would discover him. Still, by the way he stood there, maybe what he'd spied wasn't what he wanted to be seeing because he clearly looked dejected. Justin just sat staring at the man who was looking intently at the house, and all Justin wanted to do was pull out his gun and shoot the fucker. He wasn't sure why, and for more reasons than not, he would never be able to shoot someone who looked as if his day had just turned a fuckload worse by the sight of the front of a house. Yet his being there set Justin on edge. He thought maybe it had more to do with the feelings bubbling around his heart, squeezing it up tightly. Something major, fucking life-changing was about to happen, and there wasn't anything he could do about it. He'd had these feelings before. They were the ones that allowed him to disappear before the cops raided a place, to know the perfect time to pull the trigger, or to take the guy he was kidnapping off the streets. It wasn't something he ignored, at least not since he was a teen, when it helped him avoid his father's rages. The problem was, whatever it was had enabled him to sense what was about to happen, but he couldn't do anything but roll with it. Things in this world needed to be played out, and no matter how much he tried to run the other way, sooner or later he'd end up back here, waiting for this bullshit to start. The guy at the tree stood up straight, looked towards him, a quick scan, and then passed on by. He clearly could not see Justin before he trotted off towards the block of land with the hedging and house on the hill that held Jack. Justin's eyes tracked him, watching a trained man run across a road, and suddenly it became clear in his eyes that the man at the forest edge was well trained. And apparently clumsy, he thought, as the guy went arse over tit over the barbed wire fencing that lined the property on either side of the hedging. Sitting up, Justin grabbed his rifle from under the back seat as well as one of his smaller survival packs, and then as quietly and quickly as he could, he got himself out of the car. He locked it remotely, the solid thunk of the buttons descending, letting him know the car was secure. He was proud as fuck of the car he'd customized for stalking. Bag settled across his back, Justin took off across the street, ending up on the opposite side of the hedges that the other guy had tripped over. Ducking underneath the wire, he thanked his small-built frame because he now understood it wasn't clumsiness that made the man fall, but rather shit wiring. Justin crouched down behind the trees, completely out of sight, as he watched all the men on the top of the hill turn their heads in the other guy's direction before one took off after him. Justin reached back to pull his scope from a side pocket in his bag and looked at what was going on. It wasn't that he really thought there was a problem, but more like something was happening that he didn't want to miss. He watched as one of the bigger guys who hung around Jax, the red blonde one, tackled the forest chap. Shit got rough before the flash of a knife caught Justin's eyes, and his muscles worked for him. A 1-2 choreographed movement, and he was on one knee, his rifle resting against his shoulder, the scope locked on top, and his eyes trained on the millisecond of movement as they worked in front of him. It wasn't that things were moving slowly, more that his mind had been trained to take in everything, process it, and spit it out as if he were watching catsup drip, and he was able to switch what he needed to slow motion. His breath sighed out of him in long, smooth movements, and his body became a part of his weapon. Justin knew he wouldn't feel a thing until he was able to debrief. Things worked quickly, as he let himself become the surroundings. The men wrestling on the ground went from beating the shit out of each other to who would be the one who could get their cock in a hole the fastest, while the rest of the house watched on. Lights flashed past him. A car left and Justin knew who it was just by looks. Even if he didn't know names, a tall dark brooding type of face clearly. Frantic over the pace the car was moving. Justin watched on as he did with everything else in life. He was there, right? Alongside everyone else, and yet they would never know he existed. It wasn't until he saw the smile on his twink's face that a twinge hit his heart, making him want to rub the spot, stand up and join in on the fun like a normal person. And once the kissing and rutting had started, it made his heat rise into his face as his legs twitched, again making him want to stand up and storm over there, grab up his twink and not allow him to see the show. He understood the stupidity of his wants and dreams. He wasn't there for his own purpose, no matter how much his body begged him to dump everything and live in this out-of-the-way town. No one would ever know. No one would miss you. No one would come looking. All points were true, and Justin had taken 3 steps towards the group before he realized the stupidity of himself. He wasn't a little kid anymore. He didn't have a right to dream or live in idle thoughts. He had a job to do, and if he didn't get it done, his life was over. He just wished it made a difference. He just wished he couldn't see the better option standing in front of him. Realizing he was thinking like a child rather than the adult he was, Justin unclipped his scope and looked at the damage he might have caused by his sudden movements. He'd never been sloppy before, never taken his body off the job, even in those times of boredom when his mind wandered to more pleasant times. He nearly physically stood back when his eyes caught and held on his twink. He really needed to stop calling the kid that. Hell, he needed to stop thinking about him in the first place, forcing himself to put his mind back on the job he was supposed to do. His twink was looking back at Justin. At least that was his first thought, the second one being more rational. Facts were no one could see him, not at this distance, with nothing but bare eyes, and even though the night wasn't that dark, it was still enough to make distances scramble together. It didn't take long for the mood to shift and for everyone to reach the area. And with that the words came. Things were said, yelled, but it was controlled. Enough that Justin could only hear the heightened noise, not make out what anyone was saying. The men, no matter how young they looked, they were all clearly in their mid-20s adults. And the one in the center, the guy who'd ran across the street, got real jumpy, looking around himself so much that he had Justin moving, skating around the side of the house, the opposite from where the others were. Justin made it to the back just as the group who'd been around the other side started heading off into the bush. He followed, using the clear confusion to help hide himself as he sprinted towards the trees like the rest of them. He wasn't sure what was going on, but if his twink was going into those trees, he was as well. Wait. Justin nearly pulled himself up on the thought. This wasn't about the twink. It was about knowing what he was getting himself into and what was happening around him, but mostly it was about extraction, because he was there to take Jex back to his father, not to protect anyone. Swallowing a lump, he hoped it was from a bug flying into his open mouth and not from the fact that he'd lied to himself. Justin disappeared into the shrubs and hoped like hell he didn't get lost. Trees and wildlife weren't his forte. He wasn't known for outback jobs or any that didn't have high rises or suburbs. He grew up on the outskirts of an inner city, and that was where he shined. Yet here he was. Branches slapped at him, tangling in his feet, frustrating him as he continually got lost. If it wasn't for the heavy breathing and the calls of men, Justin wasn't sure he'd have ever found his way in the thick bush. He was so out of his element, and as a result he felt like a fool. Yet, as soon as he saw his destination, everything crystallized. His twink was in trouble. To be fair, they probably all were, but all Justin saw was a threat, and all he knew was that something of his was there and no way in. Fucking hell, he'd let his kid be hurt before he even got a name. Hell, he wouldn't let the kid get hurt once he finally got it, but that was something he didn't particularly want to think about. Pulling up his rifle, Justin got to the edging of the trees. A quaint little cottage sat in the middle, reminding him of sweet things he'd only ever seen in kids' books. Men were yelling while some were pulling up guns of their own, shooting. 2 were already down and 1 was well on its way. Then a guy moved and Justin's eyes narrowed in on him. He let his breath slide out of himself as he focused in on the loose cannon that was, very clearly, getting ready to grab hold of one of the men his twink hung around. He let his finger squeeze. The shot rolled out of the barrel, recoiling the butt of the rifle into his shoulder as it went flying forward. Justin was ready for the backswing and let his body roll with it all just like every other time. He was the gun and the gun was him. Justin didn't pull in air until he saw the shot hit its mark. He never had before, and he definitely wasn't going to change now. The bullet slid into the male's head. Luckily for the guy he'd saved, they'd managed to get the door at least 90% closed before this happened, which would make his cleanup a shitload easier. Washing blood and brain matter off a door was much nicer than out of carpet. His mind satisfied, he looked around, noting all the dead as he let his lungs fill up with air. His mind coming out of the clear spot it went into when shooting. It took no more than a nanosecond for his mind to click back on, but even in that time he needed a blink or two in order to focus. The area around him had gone still. Not just still in the way of startled animals and the dead, but in that creepy way when everyone holds their breath and looks at you like you have 4 heads and your cock hanging out your. Chapter 2. Fuck, Jack spat out. His hand came up, a dark handgun shining in the moonlight as he pointed it at Justin. Justin put up his free hand. Whoa mate, hold up. There was no way he was dropping his rifle, but he didn't want to look threatening. Jax's eyes narrowed. Justin could sense hatred spilling across the land toward him, but then again, it wasn't as if he was expecting anything different. Jax? Matt asked, looking from his lover to Justin and back again. I'm not going back, Jax stated. Back? Matt blinked as he turned his head back to Justin, and it seemed to him that things clicked. Kill him then. Justin smiled. He couldn't help it. The boys were definitely heading for greatness if they realized what they were saying. Then he remembered the clearing where it looked as if an animal had slaughtered all the men who had been trying to ransom off Jax to his father. He'd seen the cabin both Jax and his lover had clearly stayed the night in, and he'd seen hell he'd helped clean up the mess the 2 boys made as they took what they wanted. Freedom. Justin knew both of them were clearly willing to do everything they could to stay away from Jax's father. Jax didn't want the life his old man wanted him to become a part of, and unfortunately the only way to win against fire was to learn how to light the fuckers yourself. The fallout from it all was the old man had been overly proud of his only son. A voice came out of the blue. No. A soft voice that was almost missed but wasn't. He knew the sound came from his twink. He wasn't sure why he was shouting, not without taking his attention off Jax and Matt and their need to survive because, unlike him, they were doing what they needed to and not because they liked it. Hell, maybe Jax didn't really see much difference between a dead man and a live one. Maybe he thought killing was the only way to play, but surely Matt grew up in a place of jails and cops, so there was no way he'd be up for killing if he could see another way out. He needs to die, Jax yelled back, breaking down in a way Justin hadn't thought he was capable of. I won't go back. I won't. Justin surprised himself by saying, no one said you had to. What? Matt this time seemed to be a little more composed, but then he really didn't understand the significance of Justin being there, at least not like Jax had. No, Jax said, his head shaking slightly. Justin knew right then that he was a dead man living on borrowed time, but then he'd been living like that since he was 15 and ended up being saved by Jax's father himself and brought into the life he lived now. It was strange the things one thought of when clear death was on the menu. No, Jax yelled again. A tremble ran across that one word. It spoke of tears and remorse and guilt and a shitload of need. Jax needed to live. He needed Justin dead. He needed not to be taken back to a world where he clearly understood he'd lose everything he was part of. Jax was not his father, no matter how easily he was able to pull a trigger. Justin had known this for a while now. He'd lose himself in a way he never wanted to. He clearly wanted to be here. Loved. The gun fired a loud scream in Justin's ears. It wasn't until he realized he hadn't taken a bullet that he knew the scream hadn't come from the gun, but from his twink. Pain spiked into his chest high up. The pain was a weird type of sting that Justin found himself brushing aside as he dropped his rifle and went to the little guy. He felt fierce emotions pull him to the boy for the first time in his life. His chest heaving against cloth. He seemed to be sobbing at the sight in front of him, but nothing came out of his eyes or mouth. He was better than that. Even if he didn't understand why it felt as if he was about to lose a long-time lover instead of a man he didn't even know the name of. His twink had rolled onto his back. He seemed to twitch as blood darkened his Shirt in the same spot Justin hurt. Fucking hell, Adam. Matt was nearly screaming over the top of Jex's shoulder, holding his man in a tight embrace. Adam. Adam's plump lips parted. A little blood on the corner of his mouth. He smiled, more a grimace of pain but clearly trying to smile. I know you. Then his glassy eyes fluttered closed. 1 minute 38 seconds earlier. Adam loved running, his legs pumping under him, his arms swinging and his chest puffing. It would have been nicer if he hadn't been trying to get somewhere, and that meant keeping up with men whose legs were twice as long as his. He was sure if anyone were filming this, he'd look like a little kid trying to keep up with his parents. He finally reached the clearing, but not before grunts and shouts sounded. Adam wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. How could he help? Jump in with fist and feet? He'd never gotten the hang of fighting, either playfully or for keeps. He'd always shied away from the violence of it all. Rubbing his hands on his thigh, he looked around, his eyes catching the attention of a lovely little cottage. The wind kicked up around him, making it seem like a different place. Flowers glittered in the moonlight as a spotlight of rays hit the front of the cottage. Ivy laced up the sides of the door, with moss helping conceal it, turning it into something out of a fairy tale. Adam's mouth watered, his heart pumped harder, his palms started sweating. He looked around the clearing. Chaos met his eyes, ruining that moment of perfection with hate and violence. Adam shied away from it, wanting to turn and run, but he couldn't leave his mates there, couldn't leave his family. He shifted position, unsettled. He wanted to do something to help, but he wasn't sure what to do. What was he supposed to do? There was a rustle near him, just to one side, not as close as it should have been when Adam finally turned in that direction, making sure no one was coming behind them. His whole body hitched from the sight. Home. Adam's throat closed, finding it impossible to get air. His chest ached, bones cracking, trying to realign themselves, but the moon wasn't there yet, so he didn't have enough power to shift him completely. His feet took him forward as the gun lowered off the man's shoulder. Adam wasn't sure whom he'd hit. Friend or foe, he didn't care. His whole world stood in front of him, and he wasn't stupid enough to let him go over a technicality. Craig had been a hunter, Adam thought, and they all loved him. Sounds vibrated around him, talking, yelling really back and forth, one side harsher and then the other. He wasn't sure what was going on, and he couldn't give a shit, not when his mate stood in front of him. Adrenaline had Adam's body shaking, but he couldn't seem to move, couldn't do anything but watch as his mate listened. Nothing shifted. Nothing stirred in him as he waited for movement, waiting for his mate to give him a clue what was happening. Adam scanned the area. He couldn't seem to stop it. He needed to know what had his mate so worked up. His eyes skirted on bodies, blood, and people standing around watching the same thing he was, but unlike him, they seemed to understand what the hell was going on. Brad looked as if he was on the verge of jumping in. Adam was more than sure he would have already, if it wasn't for the grip Kyle had on Brad's shoulders. Like anyone in this situation, Adam looked towards the action. Matt was the first one he saw. Tall and lean, he was standing there just on one side of Jex, and his hand lightly on his mate's. His face turned towards Adam's mate and back to his own. I'm not going back, Jex said, his face ashen, his eyes wide, panicked. Back. Matt blinked. Then his head turned away, looking at Jex. He heard something click. Something that cramped up Adam's stomach so hard. Bile pushed up into his throat. Hot acid licked at his tonsils, his mouth started watering, gagging, needing to spit up what he was tasting. Jex's hand was stretched out, his fingers tight around the base. His gun was unsteady. In a way, that wasn't Jex. The man's face was in peril. For the first time in the history of Adam knowing Jex, and he knew it wasn't a long time, but the whole time the man hadn't flinched, not at anything, not for 1 minute. Now he was standing there, his face, his body scared shitless as a man could get without pissing himself, and a gun pointing at Adam's mate. No! Adam screamed, startling himself, and yet he was more than sure most of the noise he made was inside his head, as no one came near him. No one even seemed to look. There was a twitch to his mate, though. Had he heard? Was he as tuned into Adam as Adam was to him? He had to be. That was what it meant, wasn't it? To have a mate, to be standing this close to the person you intended to spend the rest of your life with. That had to be heady, and it had to be affecting his mate as much as it was Adam. Adam knew it did. He needs to die. Jex yelled. The words slapped across Adam's face. His heart exploded in his chest as everything he knew and would know rumbled down to a few words. He needs to die rang in his ears repeatedly, the tune that didn't make sense but held Adam's whole life. He needs to die. Adam's chest hurt, but he was too distressed to understand he needed to suck in air. The hair along his back spiked up. His leg muscles shifted, moving in a way they shouldn't, not in his human body. The tops of his fingers shifted to claws as hair grew thicker across their tops and up his forearms. The summer breeze caressed them, telling him things Adam couldn't even begin to understand. He rolled forward onto the balls of his feet as his knees ached, wanting something that just wasn't possible. Adam growled, a little sound that caught in his throat, but made him draw in a breath, easing one ache and bringing about another. Adam didn't think. All he heard ringing in his head was a song of death and a gun pointing at his mate. A mate that he'd been waiting for since he'd learned he'd get one. A mate that was going to love him like no one else would love him. He would be someone who would treasure him as if he was something special and not just another mouth to feed. He wanted someone to be his family, his lover, his other half, so that he could prove them all wrong. He was worth a lover and worth a family. He was worth so much more than those arseholes had said. He was. He had to be, because if they were right, if he wasn't worthy of one person to love him over everything else in the world, then he might as well not bother waking up in the morning. The wind shifted. At least that was what it felt like to Adam right before. Something ran into him hard and hot. It saturated his right shoulder in pain. So much pain rolled around his mind, as his body seemed to cringe in on itself, wanting away from it as fast as possible. Adam tasted dirt as he licked his lips. He wasn't sure how that happened, but apparently he was on the ground, face first in the dirt. Fucking great. Pushing up with his left arm, Adam gritted his teeth around a scream of pain. As he rolled himself onto his back, hitting the ground hard, he felt as if someone decided to stab fire-heated knives along his spine. Or they'd not bothered with that time-consuming act and just put a fire pit next to him that Adam had managed to roll into. His mouth was dry, making him swallow several times, trying to get his lips wet, but it wasn't helping. He needed liquid. He needed painkillers. What he really needed was to pass out because he hurt so fucking much. Warmth saturated him, cuddling around him, settling him like nothing else could. The only thing he could smell or simply care about at this moment. Cracking his eyes open, Adam looked up at his mate. He was on his knees by Adam's side and looking as sick as Adam felt before all the pain started. His arm was up over his chest, hand wrapped around his right shoulder as if he was holding on to something. He was a fair bit older than them, Adam suddenly realized. The guy's face appeared to be a frown, the wrinkles in his forehead and in the corners of his eyes aging him. His brown hair, clean cut, averaged to a point that Adam felt he must had dressed himself to look that way. All Adam saw was perfection. All he saw was home. Mate. I know you. He breathed out, needing to talk, and apparently that was all he could say. Chapter 3. Pain radiated across his shoulder and back. Adam tried to breathe through the ache as he thought about the idea of shifting into a more comfortable position. He wasn't sure if moving would cause his stomach to roll out his mouth, or had he settled enough. It was just the after effects of when they'd moved him the first time, when he'd passed out as they'd lifted him off the ground, but not before he vomited a little, according to the taste in his mouth. Fucking hell, Jax. Shut up. Shit fucking happens every fucking day, so deal with it and move on. The voice spoke gently, mutely, close. So close as if it came from someone leaning against the back of the lounge he lay on. Fathom wished to think he would place the man his mate had to be, though he didn't recognize the voice. With his arse braced on the edge, his legs crossed, maybe along with his arms, still looking like he didn't give a shit about anything. Yet there he stood, watching, waiting, making sure Adam was safe and sound. His mate. Adam took in a slow breath, relaxing into the moment of wonder and peace and understanding where he stood, finally, after a lifetime of never quite figuring it out. But what the fuck, mate? You were born in a fucking princess castle. A loving mother doting on your arse. You know it ain't your fault. The kid threw himself in front of a bullet. What could you do? Change its fucking direction while it was moving? Hey now, why don't we all calm down? Eamon's voice seemed to roll through the house, through Adam's every nerve. Eamon always had that effect on him and the others he knew, but definitely on him. Shelter, trust, and forgiveness. I am calm, his mate said, calm as rain. Jex, on the other hand, needs his ours handed to him so he'll stop crying like a fucking bitch. Seriously, mate, Matt said. Adam smiled. Clearly Matt was at the end of his limit. You need to watch your mouth. And what are you gonna do if I don't, mate? Stand there while I splatter your brains all over this pretty little house? You got no idea who you're up against. Not where I'm concerned, his mate countered. And who am I up against? A hired killer? Matt spat back. Then there was silence. It was a saying, apparently it was the reality of the moment. Adam wanted to sit up. He wanted to see what was on his mate's face. He just wanted to stare at it for a bit, but the idea of what emotion would be lacking, especially when dealing with people he didn't know, scared the shit out of Adam a little. Fuck, Matt yelled. Fucking killer in this house. He mumbled the words, tickling at Adam's ears. See, Eamon? We should have fucking killed him when we had the chance. Adam shot up. No. The world tilting sideways had him bracing himself, his fingers curling around the top of the lounge. The head rush didn't stop him from pulling himself up, trying to get over the top of the lounge. He tried to get between everyone else and his mate. He needed to protect his mate. Lie back down, Adam's mate snapped at him, his hands solid and soft on him. Heat pooled from those 2 points of contact and rolled around his blood stream, heating him up, making him want. Don't fucking talk to him like that. Kyle's voice was like a slap or more. Like spritz of ice-cold water pumping on him, like he was a dog humping his owner's leg. Like what? Like I give a shit if he fucking hurt himself for no good bloody reason, his mate said as he gently placed Adam back onto the lounge where he had been. That's enough, Eamon said in his alpha voice, as Adam liked to call it. The others just called him the boss. Adam, lie back down. We don't want you hurt any more than you already are. Matt, you need to close your mouth. You're starting to worry me with all this calling for death. Don't we remember where Craig came from? What about Jex? Clearly the connection there means something important for you to call for the death of another man's mate just so you don't have to deal with what's following you. Eamon slowly shook his head, before ending with, you really want to be that man? More silence. At least, Adam hoped it was silence and not him losing his hearing as he breathed in deep. Laying back down hurt more than getting up. And his head still didn't want to play nice. At least his stomach was still. His head didn't throb. He just didn't want to have to deal with the facts of being awake or moving too much. Overall, he seemed to be a lot better than he thought he should be after being shot. He'd been shot. Shot. Like a bullet had slammed into his shoulder. Adam guessed he should have been grateful it had only been his shoulder, but then he'd not really thought about the fact that he was putting himself in front of a bullet. A bullet. Shot. His throat blocked open, blocked a hiccup of oxygen allowed in at one time. It wasn't enough. Not enough. Shot. He could have died. He could have died and hurt so many people. He took shot. Hands shook him lightly, so lightly Adam could hardly feel it. Voices sounded around him, but they just rolled into the flow of his own voice. Blackness overtook his vision yet again, but this time he wasn't seeing it. He didn't have that much space inside his head. He didn't have any space in there. Nothing. There was nothing, nothing. Nothing. His chest shuddered, trying to pull in more air, but it couldn't get past his throat. Didn't. Adam tried to move. He needed to move to get some space, to get some air, but he couldn't. Hands held him down, keeping him still, trying to tell him something, but he couldn't understand anything. Rope tightened around his shoulders, his elbows, his middle scraping against his skin, keeping him still, making sure he couldn't get away. He screamed, but nothing came out. He couldn't hear himself. Couldn't get the words out of his mouth. Couldn't get the sound outside his head. Stop. The voice rang against the insides, hitting all corners. It was the only thing he could hear, and the only thing making sense, and it seemed to grip his shoulders and make Adam look at him. Blackness was still his world, but there was something settling against him. Soft cotton packed his ears as silk rubbed against his heated flesh. Breath. The voice was different now. He breathed. Things settled quickly from there. At least it felt that way to Adam. Darkness stayed until he blinked, and then everything snapped back to normal. Heat splashed at his cheeks. He didn't understand why, except that Eamon was leaning over him, his hands on his shoulders. His mate was a shadow above him. Adam tried not to look at him but couldn't make himself stop. Concerned brows looked down at him, eyes that held a hint of worry. Yeah. Maybe Adam didn't know him for long or at all, but he knew people and he understood a worried person when he saw one. The idea he'd had a breakdown in front of his mate was humiliating. Didn't inspire a whole lot of anything, least of all strength. However, the concern on his mate's face, though it didn't lessen his embarrassment, did seem to make his chest puff up as the cavity filled. "Justin, can you please get Adam a drink?" Eamon asked the man behind him, though Adam made that assumption from process of elimination. "Sure thing, document." Adam's mate Justin, fuck him raw. His mate's name was Justin and he cared. And he felt, and he was right there doing something to help Adam out. Adam sighed into the cushion under him, not caring about the fact that Eamon still held him, still watched, waiting for something major to happen. Didn't care about the many number of things he'd happily make a fool of himself repeatedly if that was the only way he'd see that look on Justin's face. "Here," Justin said. His voice caressed Adam, licking against the sensitive skin, making him want more and need deeper. Eamon had eased away from Adam, most likely when he'd seen Justin close in on the lounge, so Adam only had to reach up to take hold of the cup. Then, awkwardness happened as he held a cup above him without any way of drinking. Not the way he was lying, not unless he wanted to pour the contents over his face and see what hit. He shifted, trying to get himself into a different position to drink. His uninjured hand was holding the cup, the other one nearly crippled. His dominant hand made the tilting of a cup difficult, let alone trying to do so. When upside down, Justin chuckled softly as he held the cup, gripping it in his palm as his fingers trapped Adam's to the cool glass. Adam licked his lips, his eyes unable to break contact as arms and hands helped him sit up so he was able to drink and feel a little less helpless. "Hi," he whispered as those fingers let him loose, and his lips wet from a sip of water, all without looking away. "I'm Adam." Justin smiled, his lips slimming a little as they stayed together, his eyes sparkling with laughter. "Justin." They shared a moment, one of those moments that was all squishy and mushy and had him wanting to throw it all away as he stripped them both down and straddled Justin's lap. "And with that, gentlemen, it's time for bed," Eamon said, clapping his hands. And unlike the first time he'd pulled out of his breakdown, he didn't feel the need to blush, even though clearly everyone in the room was having a bit of a laugh at him. "We all staying here?" Matt asked from over near the dining table. "I think it's for the best," Eamon said with a nod, before he leant down and whispered something in Chris' ear. It took everything in Adam to block out those words. Some things he didn't need to know, and as close as both men were standing, he'd have heard. "Where we all gonna fit?" Matt asked, clearly wanting to get to bed fast. "You and Jex can have my room," Adam told Matt, the words popping out of his mouth without thought. It wasn't as if he stayed in there much anyway. "Thanks, Adam," Jex said, standing up, grabbing hold of Matt's arm and pulling him to his feet. "Let it go, babe." His voice sounded lighter, almost as if he was having a laugh at something. "How can I?" Matt asked as Jex walked them up the stairs. "Remind me to get them to change the sheets," Adam muttered as he settled his head on the back of the lounge, his eyes caressing Justin's. "You hide your loot?" Kyle asked with a laugh. Adam's head came up in panic. "Shit, no. Go save it for me, Kyle, please." He looked at his buddy with puppy eyes and fluttering lashes. Kyle laughed harder. "That look ain't worked on me in years, buddy. Ask your mate to get it for you." Adam turned to face Justin, trying his hardest to act as if what Kyle said was nothing more than the term and not the werewolf meaning. "Would ya?" Justin stared at Adam for a long moment before he sighed. "Where am I headin'?" Adam tried not to grin in triumph. "Up the stairs, second on the right." "Really? It's the one Jex and Matt are about to start fucking in," Colin said, as Justin got up off the lounge. "They wouldn't have closed the door yet." "Yet." That came from Tim. Adam had forgotten they were even there, sitting at the dining table. "I didn't know they knew the meaning." Chapter 5. Fire. The voice moved further away from the door, but Justin could hear it just as strongly as if the man was standing right next to him. He was sure the person yelling was Phil. Rolling Adam off him, Justin sprang into action. His pants went up his legs, and his shirt was in his hand as he opened the door, looking back to make sure. "Adam." "What?" He wasn't sure, but he had to check, and though his heart did a slight jump at the fact that Adam's sweats were already up against his hip, he wasn't sure what that feeling actually meant. Opening the door, Justin went to see what was going on. It was something else. That was suddenly new. Though he was never one to miss what was going on in a house he was staying at, this time there was something different. This time he actually cared. Running down the stairs, Justin was just in time to see Eamon and Chris rush down the hall. Eamon only wore a pair of worn leather pants while Chris had on sweats along with thick fancy leather cuffs wrapped around both wrists. Justin noticed that Chris also had a cuff around one of his ankles but was sure he had them on both ankles, his left leg being caught up in the fabric. Coming into the lounge room, Justin got a little sidetracked by Craig. Not only did he have a weapon in his hand, but he looked as if he was about to hand one of Justin's back to him. Justin's brows rose in question with a jerky movement that he couldn't interpret as anything other than take this. This left him to fight or shrug off the moment, so he took the weapon. At least this way he'd get his gun back and feel like he held some solid ground. Tucking the Glock into the back of his jeans, trying not to shudder from the fact that he was sliding the barrel of a gun against his arse, hell, he was settling the tip into the top of his arse crack. The cold metal scrape had an odd soothing quality to it, something that he couldn't hide from himself even with the horror and risks of carrying a loaded gun that way. The heavy weight of the weapon pulled at his pants and made it feel as if it was going to fall out at any moment. If he'd ever held a gun this way, it had been a long time ago. He ended up being one of the last people out the door. Craig was still fiddling with something before joining them on the front landing. First thing Justin did was look around. The front light wasn't on. Instead, light was spilling from inside, lighting up the men standing around just enough for Justin to see them. Most of the larger men stood around Eamon. Justin wasn't sure if they realized what they were doing or if it was unintentional or instinctual, but he saw it as protecting their boss, because the way they stood, there was no way anyone was going to be able to off Eamon, at least not without hitting another man first. The night sky flashed with lights. They were the emergency type that only lit up the area it touched for those brief minutes, leaving everything else in complete darkness. There was no wind, perfect sniper weather. He only wished that thought didn't make his finger twitch for his binoculars. On instinct, Justin looked towards his car. Fuck me, he breathed out. He felt his legs move him towards his car, which was hidden behind light and water and noise and smoke. Sorry, mate, Craig said as his hand hit hard against his back, then disappeared. Justin slowly shook his head, completely stupefied by what he was seeing. His car had been set on fire. He probably should have hidden it better, but a hick town with men who didn't know squat, okay, that probably wasn't fair. Justin had been slack in his surveillance. Fucking hell. He looked around. He didn't want to say it, didn't want to think it, didn't want to fucking feel it, but what the fuck, man? His car was on fire. His eyes danced around trying to work out all this bullshit as fast as he could, but for some reason it wasn't happening. Why wasn't it happening? Why was this fucking happening? Justin, Adam said, his hand on his arm, callus scraping lightly against the hair. The novelty made him pause. A hot little man who actually gets his hands dirty. Big eyes stared at him as if he was something special, as if he hadn't spent his life killing. Justin swallowed. The kid had a crush on someone that didn't exist. It was there in his eyes, and he couldn't think of a thing to do but take what was offered, even if he knew he was destined to break the kid's heart. What the fuck's going on? Justin asked, because he needed to get away from those eyes and the reality that he wasn't good enough to be seen from them. There wasn't anything wrong with him. Justin's life was a reality he was lucky to have. He had money stashed away, saved for nothing except so that he'd never have to ask for anything if he ended up on the street. The only way he'd end up on the street was if he never went home, because if he did, without Jex, he wouldn't be needing any money, which was the fun side of working for a boss whose retirement plan entailed a short chain, cement, and a cheesy push off a pier. Or maybe it'd be easier and quicker just to start talking about the fishes. That's not really any of your business, Brad said. He was the furthest from the group, just this side of the light from the house, nearly stepping into the flashing lights from the fire trucks. He was a cop. Justin didn't need to know what he did to see that. He could smell it on the fucker from a mile off, and that was behind a closed window, with his car full of gas. Brad was a cop, young and maybe a little naive, but there was definitely something there that wasn't in a lot of cops. Something that explained a lot. If only he knew what way he was meant to be. Looking to get a fucking clue. And there was a massive point here, right on this fucking patch of driveway. The point was driving Justin nuts as he sat back and took it all in because none of it fucking mattered. Not their secret, not this little boy with a crush, and not his car and all his fucking weapons. Fuck. Heat boiled in his head as if acid was pumping out of his organs, making him want to rip at his skin and splash it all over everyone else so he could watch them all bubble and die with slow agony on the faces. Fingers squeezed tight on his arms. A soothing wash covered him, taking that heat, smothering it as if it never existed. They're werewolves, Craig said out of the blue and into a reality that Justin didn't even want to think about. Oh, okay. He nodded. Yeah, that was all he needed to deal with those fuckers again. Fuck again. One of the other guys laughed. It was a little off, but Justin thought the sound was supposed to make it look as if Craig was crazy. It didn't work, but just proved that everything was about to become real. Real. Justin wanted to laugh because werewolves were the most real fucking things in the world. Slap sarcasm here, please. Okay. Adam asked at his side, his face looking as if he was waiting for an explosion. Too bad Justin wasn't that dramatic, and if it hadn't been for him killing a handful of them in his early 20s, he'd have still held his footing, because that was what he was taught to do. Run with it until you're proven right or kill them all. Hell, he'd been known to do both. Seen one before? Craig, the mouthpiece of this group, asked. Justin glanced around at the rest of them, all open-mouthed, shocked that a person would know what the hell was going on. Amateurs. Luckily for them, he wasn't that much of a con man. Huh. Apparently, Eamon had left the group along with Brad and Kyle. When did that happen? Shrugging off anything other than the ones that were still there, Justin flashed a quick look at Adam. He hated himself for needing to, even as he told himself he'd regret the look in Adam's eyes. Killed a few, he said, understanding why the look needed to happen because, as the words left his mouth, Justin did a lot to stop himself from reacting to Adam's gasp. Why did it hurt so much to prove to this little man reality was there even if he wanted to admit it or not? People weren't nice. They generally weren't loyal, and they definitely took what they wanted and left the trusting a rasp of flesh with nothing to fill their cores. Reality made a mockery of the innocence in people's hearts, and it hurt like hell to have to step into the light. However, Adam had started it, and Justin wasn't the type to hold back who he was. He just wondered how long the look of worship stayed in the other man's eyes, and why he wanted to treasure it until it disappeared. Reality was a bitch that Adam didn't want any part of, so when his mate talked about killing werewolves as if he was born to do it, he just shrugged it off. It wasn't that it didn't matter, but for the record, his mate was a killer. That had been established before he'd let the man fuck him. Adding werewolves just turned it all into what Craig did, and he came around. Hell, Craig was happier now that he was on their side, and Adam had to believe his mate would be the same. Who could live a life one kill at a time? Who could be happy to stay that way their whole life? Wasn't there a time that they all wanted to give up, give in, and live on an island away from everyone? Wasn't that what all those movies said? Wasn't that what it was all about? Waking up and realizing life held no meaning? Smiling up at his mate, Adam ran his fingers against the soft skin on the inner portion of Justin's forearm. Justin felt his toes shifting under him as his body lit up, wanting more than just that simple touch from Adam. At least you'll know what you're up against then, Craig said, talking the way he did when Dan had entered the room. It wasn't friendly, and yet there wasn't a whole heap of hostility, but rather more a guarded waiting. Adam could tell he didn't know what to expect, but still he was trying most. Probably for Adam's benefit. Yeah, stoked man, Justin said in a way that told of eye rolling even if one were standing in a different state. Adam laughed, the mirth just up and puffed out of him as his fingers worked their way into the other man's elbow. He felt the shift of muscle and tendons. As Justin rolled his arm out slightly, giving Adam more room. It might not have been the most important thing going on that night, but Adam's heart beat a little smoother behind his ribs from the knowledge that his mate wanted his touch. The heat helped, but all Adam really wanted was to get Justin behind a closed door. He didn't really give a shit if it locked or not. When Adam finally looked up into Justin's face, it was to find the other men looking down at him. The softness in his eyes had Adam swallowing hard around his tongue. He was only getting to see so much. Then Justin blinked and looked over Adam's shoulder, his face closing up. Again. What's the outcome? He asked whoever was behind them. Adam didn't really care. Not at this moment. Not when he was fighting down an uneasy wave of tears. Why he had the need he didn't know. He should have been happy he was the only one getting to see tenderness from Justin, but instead there was something truly sad about him being so guarded, which hit at Adam hard. Lost it all, Eamon said, sounding sorry. You sure? Justin's body shifted away from Adam, but it wasn't as if he was getting away, or at least Adam hoped that wasn't what Justin wanted, but more like he was trying to see something even if there wasn't a chance in hell. Are they done with it? Yeah, tow truck's on the way. Shit. And off the man went. Okay then, Eamon said, looking puzzled and scratching his head as he gazed around at all of them. Kyle laughed. Seems like he didn't believe ya, boss. Or he knows something we don't, Craig put in. Clearly, Chris quipped. Ain't like there isn't a list on that count. The group laughed as they stood there waiting to see what the man was about to do. Fatigue hit hard at Adam through the weight as the excitement faded. His shoulders sagged, and all he wanted to do was sit down. Okay, so he probably wanted to lie in bed, but that seemed too far. So, one of you fuckers gonna help? Justin called out from the darkness. He seemed far away and right up close all at the same time. Adam assumed that was because of where the house sat on the property and the eerie quietness of the area now that the firemen had all pissed off. They all seemed to look over at Eamon. It was a reaction. It was instinct, and no matter how much Adam wanted Justin to be there with him, he wasn't one of them yet, and instinct had them needing to get a yes from the alpha to help. The lone wolf entered the pack. Chapter 6. Justin's eyes flashed open, his body tingling with a sense of something happening that shouldn't have been. He lay on the bed, Adam's head on his shoulder, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to everything, safe in Justin's arms. Justin's heart did something weird as the thought swept into his brain, and his breath hitched a little at the realization that he was making Adam feel that it wasn't a concept Justin wanted to look into, not the fact that up until then he'd been sleeping just as softly, just as easy in Adam's arms, knowing that he was safe and nothing was going to happen to the little guy. He would make sure nothing was going to happen because he was there, with Justin, where he should be. It was almost as if Justin had been missing this one element, that the reasons he'd never been able to relax was because he wasn't protecting what was his. How could he have been, when Adam was someone he'd never met before? Now, though, he could breathe easy knowing that little else was important, and if trouble appeared, at least he knew where Adam was, knowing the kid was safe. His shoulders shifted hard. A shiver nearly moved him across the bed as something that would have felt like butterflies to anyone else twisted up his insides. His arms tightened around Adam as he rolled the other man over onto the other side of the bed. He whispered something about a bathroom to a man not quite waking up, but clearly noticing something was going on. Out of bed, Justin pulled on his jeans and picked up the gun Craig had given him. He wasn't sure if he'd need it. Honestly, Justin was hoping whatever he was feeling was coming from the house, due to the fact that he didn't know the layout, didn't know who was here, who wasn't, or if the others would be coming back. He quickly checked Adam's window. It was on the side of the house, looking out over the valley and trees. It was dark, just coming up to first light, the world holding a crispness Justin loved. It was when a second wind came, though. From a sudden cold snap right before the world righted itself again. The window was locked, but Justin double-checked it, and even if it wasn't, there was no way anyone would be getting into the house this way unless they had climbing equipment, and then what was the point? Adam had insisted that he sleep in his own bed when they'd gotten back in. He was exhausted and pushed to his limits from the people around him and the stupidity of thinking they could leave things alone and not killed. Justin had just wanted to lock himself in a room, but instead he'd fussed around and helped as Adam stripped his bedding and changed it all, right down to the quilt cover. It had been a weird moment as he shifted pillowcases around when he realized what he was doing, and that he'd not minded. He'd catered to someone else's request when there hadn't been a reason to, and he'd done it with a smile and jokes. He then stripped down and crawled into bed, where he closed his eyes and relaxed as he'd never done before. Though what was truly scary was the fact that when Adam joined him, he'd rolled the little guy over his body, making sure he was away from any threat, pulling him in close and settled in. For the night. He'd never felt the need to cuddle once in his life, even though he'd slept in countless men's bed. He'd never cared about them, not like he was realizing he cared for Adam, and that should have scared the shit out of him, but it didn't. Shirt and shoes in hand, Justin left the room, making sure he didn't disturb the sleeping man. It wouldn't do Adam any good to expect Justin back. He didn't put his shoes on until he'd reached the steps and gone down a few. The feeling in his stomach was getting worse, especially as he learned the house was still, everyone clearly asleep. Not a sound, not even from the places he expected to find them. Gun in reach on the step, Justin pulled the shirt over his head as he slipped one shoe on and then bent to fix it up as he slipped on the second. When he was done, he got his gun ready. Something didn't feel right and he didn't have a clue what. However, he had been in this spot before. Something was about to happen. It was amazing how many times running and swinging was actually the better option, where sometimes waiting around failed. This wasn't one of those moments, but he'd not been watching. He'd not been caring about the outside world, and because of that, he didn't know which direction to look or how long he'd been feeling this way before it got intense enough to coax him away from his lover. Not knowing what he was about to run into wasn't an experience he liked, but shit happened all the time, and no matter how much you watched, you couldn't see everything. This was one of those times, and he needed to stop bitching and moaning and start figuring out what he was going to do. Going into the front area of the house made his feet falter. He wanted to turn around and run back upstairs to make sure Adam was okay, but that was stupid. Adam was fine. Everything was fine. Straightening up, Justin realized just how true that thought was. Everything was fine. There wasn't a light on, nothing but a slight sparkle of outside light pouring in through the sliding door leading out to a deep veranda. Taking a long look around, he quickly checked to make sure someone had locked the doors before heading towards the laundry that just happened to be in the basement, which was a novelty in itself. The strangeness of it came from the fact that the door was hidden to look like a hall cupboard, and if Justin hadn't helped carry in his weapons down there after getting them from his hot, charred car, he'd not have known it existed. Closing the door softly behind him, he wondered briefly what the family who'd built the house was expecting when they made the basement. Not only was it all concrete and heavy wood, but the door itself had a crossbolt, and Justin was more than sure a wooden wall pulled out across the whole top step. Downstairs was a vast empty space, easily as big as the rest of the house, or at least the first floor, and clearly able to set up a lot of people for a short time or a small family for a long time. As it was, the floors held bags, boxes, and crates of what Justin gathered were Craig's weapons. There wasn't anything that told him that except the fact that when they'd put all of his stuff down here, one couldn't tell where his started and Craig's began. On the far side was the laundry, holding that same effect as the top of the stairs, as if something could come out and block the entrance. Justin got that idea from the small groove cut into the flooring just in front of it. The design hadn't been hidden, but just put away until it was needed. Grabbing the bag he needed, he strapped himself up, and taking the key off the hook outside the laundry door, he slipped out, locking it up behind him. He wasn't really worried, but he didn't want to give anyone an advantage, especially because if Justin was on the outside wanting to get in, that was definitely the door he'd try first. It was facing the backyard and stood under the shadow of the veranda. No one was going to see him, not unless the person stood looking at the door itself. After the lock engaged, Justin did what he did best. He disappeared into the underbrush and went to see what had his guts in knots. The body hit the deck first, making a solid thud on the wood as Justin continued up the stair behind him. The guy grunted, panting as he tried to scurry away from him. Justin took his time. He was in a particular mood, playing with a person marked for death, and he didn't want to say it was his specialty, mostly because he didn't actually like being this person who killed. It was just necessity. Justin had even come up with a character version of himself for just these moments, one that liked the torture, like that panicked look in their eyes as they realized death was on the horizon. And yet they couldn't stop hoping they'd be able to get out of it, that they'd be alive at the end. This guy, however, didn't have that look. Yeah, he wanted to get away. He didn't want to be there, but it seemed more like he was playing up an instinct he didn't have. Justin wasn't really sure why, but it seemed to make the guy feel better to try and play games with Justin, so he let him. It wasn't the man's fault. Justin had watched him and two others for over an hour listening. As they bitched about the horribleness of surveillance, they spoke big words. Before Justin circled back to the house and decided to take a jog, it wasn't really the man's fault that Justin had made the decision after learning they were heading back to the boss, then had clearly marked the time he needed before they gave a shit one way or another about this lone man. It wasn't truly his fault that the guy had fallen for his stupidity, even though he'd clearly come out of a house that held a hunter. Then again, big men who hunted big game really weren't bright, and they didn't need to be, because they weren't hunting anything that could think. At least that was what Justin had learnt in his time on his job. He honestly thought it was harder to kill an animal than it was a person. He'd always taken the analogy that it was easier to pick off sheep. Hell, you could do that in your own backyard when surrounded by other sheep. People liked to believe they were smarter than they were. Of course, most realized bullshit when they saw it, and for those million they had nothing to worry about. It was the sheep, the followers of the world, who needed something to sit behind. They needed an idea. It wasn't always their fault that the idea they chose to pursue was the one getting them killed. Yeah, he might be jaded, but then what else was he supposed to be when he'd only ever been introduced to two kinds, the ones that led the sheep and eventually started believing their own cast iron bullshit, and the sheep themselves. So are you ready to talk? Justin asked the beaten man. He wasn't bad off, though Justin hadn't been kind to him as he dragged him through the shrubs and trees and then over the long line of grass. Fuck off, fag, he spat out. The words were flung at Justin, and if he'd given a shit what anyone thought, they might have stuck. As it was, they were only words he'd heard thousands of times before, spoken by wankers worried their cocks might just be like what they were seeing. Crouching down, Justin used his eyes and lips to get the over-the-top flirt look on his face, the one that he'd used to snag many a man in his time, the one that didn't waste fucking time but got down to the point. Running fingers down the hunter's cheek, he fluttered, licking his bottom lip. Are you sure? The guy flipped, pushing himself back so fast and with such strength that he ended up smacking his head against the railing of the porch while spouting a shitload of noise Justin was sure were words. The sliding door sounded behind him. Justin wasn't sure what had taken the bastards so long to come out, since he knew they were up. He'd seen Adam wake, looking around frantically as he searched for Justin, and then sit at the dining table and talk to someone out of view with sadness in his body language. Justin didn't like that look. He didn't like that he'd made Adam feel like that, but there wasn't anything he could have done about it without everyone seeing him and asking questions he didn't know the answer to yet. The sliding door did what it did best by opening up and letting a spill of just awakened males shuffle their way onto the deck, the smell of coffee flowing before them, making Justin's mouth water and his gut growl. Hello, Tony. Craig's voice was colder than Justin had ever heard it, even when he'd first rocked up. Pussy faggot, the man named Tony spat out. Venom laced every syllable, matching the hatred spilling from his eyes. That was always your problem, wasn't it? Wanted but never had a chance, Craig said with a cool tone. The man spat out more words. Apparently he'd learned to be closed-lipped about everything except his sexuality, which in Justin's opinion spoke more about an internal debate than what anyone on the outside said. Clearly the man didn't want to be seen, thought of, or shared in a joke that questioned his liking of vagina. Justin smiled. It wasn't a nice smile, and as expected, got his old pal Tony's mouth muttering shit that wasn't respectful, and quite frankly Justin didn't want to hear. He ain't gonna tell us anything, Craig told him. I gathered, was Justin's only reply. He knew it was a bad idea to bring the man up here, but something hadn't allowed him just to shoot them all. Something was holding his trigger finger back, and he didn't have the time to ponder why while he'd been tying down the fuckers. Should I just kill him then? Justin asked as he pulled his gun out of the holster at the small of his back. Quick fingers and easy movements, and it was ready and aiming. Probably not here, Craig said over his shoulder as he got to his feet, dragging Tony with him by his collar. Don't want the hassle of getting blood out of the wood. Justin looked down at the dark red wood. Its perfection spoke of refurbishing. Makes sense. Justin swooped down and grabbed Tony by the back of the legs, and with a little help from Craig, tipped the fucker over the end. Both stood for a moment watching as the guy tumbled down, hitting the ground with a thud and a heavy moan. It didn't take long for him to get onto his feet. He was one of Craig's people, and Craig had given him a brief explanation of what he used to be. Justin took his time putting his handgun back into the holster before pulling another out from under his arms. He then unclipped his silencer and twirled it onto the end as they both stood there watching the guy hobble off towards the tree. Taking aim, Justin let go of everything but the metal in his hands and air between him and his victim, then licked his lips and pulled the trigger. There was a sharp recoil and a soft sound. Justin stayed with the bullet as it whirled itself across the air, eating up the distance in seconds before sliding softly into the running man's skull and exploding out the other. Chapter 7. His mate was a killer. There it rang again inside Adam's head as he watched Justin and Craig trot down the veranda stairs and quickly deal with a body, and by deal he meant dragging the body over to an already burnt-out area before pulling out the leftover branches that hadn't quite disintegrated and covering the body with that, then grabbing some green stuff and piling that on top. Then flames. It lit quickly and efficiently, and smelt of a bush fire within minutes. His mate was a killer, Adam thought again as he descended the stair with everyone else walking as a group in silence over to the two men standing, watching the fire destroy the body. Again and again his mind sang the tune his mate was a killer. Yeah, it might have been trying to get him to truly see what he should already know. Especially now, with an actual body right there burning away a secret no one present would tell. Adam's mate was a killer. That mouthful of reality tasted sour as he tried to work out why it wasn't bothering him. Was he suicidal? Was he a little girl in her rebellion streak? No, he was trusting. Chris was always going on and on about that and what he saw and how he dealt with the world at large. What shocked Adam wasn't the fact his mate was a killer. He'd known that. Just happened to be the first time he'd seen it. He'd seen that cold look on Justin's face and the mechanics of his body as he played and then took down his target. He hadn't heard what the men had said, at least not what Craig and Justin had said. He'd turned his ears from the spewing hatred, but it all hit too close to home for him to ignore it completely. So was that what was getting at him? Not that his mate killed a man, but that something in Adam had been satisfied to have it all stop, to have someone who spat hatred at others for no reason be killed, ended like they all should be? Was that it? A wish and prayer he'd been trying to get someone to hear. Finally played out by a man Adam saw as his protection in life, as his one good thing that would turn the world upside down for him. The protector part might have been true, but the rest not so much. Even if he wished he were that sort of man, he wasn't. He didn't believe in killing, nor did he wish he could say people deserved what they got. No, it seemed the better answer was that Adam didn't want to see Justin as anything but the man he would spend the rest of his life with, and because he didn't see the importance of losing his someone special over the enemy, he let everything else fall away and stepped up next to that very man. This close to the only person in Adam's world, he could hear the moon's seduction beckoning him, prickling up the hairs on his arms and thighs, wanting him to change, but it wasn't strong enough. He howled, wanting out as the human trapped him in a cage of skin, tissue, ligaments, and bones. His other half was in strong agreement. They'd do anything to be with Justin. And to start, that everything from Justin's past had to be forgiven, not forgotten, but left to the past where it belonged. They were together, and it didn't matter what happened. This was where Adam needed to be. This was where he wanted to be. It's not that easy, mate. Craig was staying off to one side. The fear of talking himself out of, then into a relationship started trickling away, and the world outside him started making sense. Why the fuck not? Justin's voice was low and deadly serious, to the point that one could hear the need for blood under each word. Adam had taken a second in the early moments of his pain to consider that Justin was like Jex, that cold, almost detached personality. However, Justin was nothing like Jex. He held life under all his calm, a clam that he would show. It made Adam want to smile. Even though he had no problem being the only person to see emotion from the man he loved, it was nice to realize his mate might be a person to be proud of him and to show the world that. Because we don't want to put our lovers in harm's way, Matt snapped at him. That's why. Justin's eyes narrowed. Because stepping back and letting shit go is really helping to protect them. His lip lifted up in clear disgust. You leave yourself open to being picked off. They only come at us once a month. So far. But it looks to me that the numbers are dwindling, and you know what men like that do when they feel they're about to fucking lose. He turned dramatically and pointed as he looked down at the burning body. What if they'd had the balls to start shooting? Or if they'd lit the house on fire last night? But they don't. Matt snapped. To Adam, it seemed like Matt was saying that on principle, not about the point being made, because he was making a fucking good one. Adam could tell not only from his position but because Craig had started to think. His hands on his hips, his stance wide, ready for anything as his eyes seemed to focus on one single point. Yet, Jex said, his hand on Matt's back. Adam was sure Jex's fingers were quickly tucked into his mate's jeans. He'd seen Jex do that multiple times, mostly when he'd become the center of attention when everyone turned their eyes onto him. This time, though, it seemed more about relaxing Matt, making sure his mate knew he was with him, even as he disagreed. What the fuck, Jex? You can't honestly say he's here to make things all fucking better. Course not, but out of us all, who knows crazed killers better than that man? Jex pointed, clearly meaning Justin was one. Fuck. Adam looked over at Justin, and it wasn't hard. He hadn't been able to take his mind off the man since he first laid eyes on him, but there was definitely something in actually looking for the sake of looking because he was allowed to. Justin took that moment to laugh. It rattled up Adam's spine, making him want to squirm, to move away, closer to his mate, giving him comfort because, unlike with everyone else there, something in Adam wanted to cry because of that one fucking sound. He found himself stepping closer, his fingers reaching out, lingering lightly on the other man's knuckles. Sparks sizzled between them. If Adam cared to believe, he could actually see them. On the second stroke down, Justin's fingers moved, brushing back, connecting, showing Adam it wasn't one-sided. Their gazes locked, though it wasn't a stretch. Justin wasn't that much taller than Adam was, though their physique was completely different. Where Justin was buff, built like a rock, Adam was willowy, easily picked up by the wind. He knew he wasn't the worst person to look at. Hell, if he let himself actually believe anything that was said about him. He understood he was hot, but he couldn't quite believe it. Couldn't quite get the voice of his father and brothers out of his head as they told him how it all made sense, that he looked like a girl, so it wasn't that far a stretch for men to want to fuck him like one. Granted, that had not been the biggest problem. No, it had come from all those times he'd listened to his brothers going on and on about the things they told their women to get them into bed. Worse was when his father had come in, laughing and giving them advice on how to get laid in 2 easy steps. Only the things they'd said had been exactly what he'd seen in the men around him, not his friends but the ones in bars and clubs, all wanting his arse for one thing and one thing only. Good news was that he'd learned what he'd liked from those types. If they didn't give a shit about Adam, why should he have to care about them? And if no one in the room gave 2 shits, then all it was that free for all, the winner, sexual gratification. Justin's eyes held a sad edge. They were so soft they lit up Adam's inside, making him tingle from his toes up, licking at his balls before caressing his chest, his neck, running though his hair. He wanted to lean in and take a kiss, something sweet to go with that softness, but he wasn't sure if it was his to take. Like, yeah, they'd fucked, but when had that given a man rights? Even so, Adam leant in close, their lips touching. A hot dry brush was barely anything, but it held that same spark, taking him away from everything, the fact that others were around him, or even the idea he might not be welcomed in taking what he wasn't given. Adam couldn't help but step into the kiss, their bodies lining up to perfection, and the slight need to tilt his head gave Adam a sweet little kick of lust he needed. It would be better because he knew he wouldn't hurt Justin's neck or have him complaining of the same thing. Could be kind of a mood killer if the mood hadn't been set properly. Justin's hands landed on Adam's hips, pulling him in close, still grinding them up nice and tight, making Adam shudder and want to pull Justin off into the long grass so they could get some open zippers and moisture mixed in with their lip lock. Their cocks lined up, pushed, shoved and rocked against each other. Their mouths attacked. Yet Justin stayed this side of courteous in a way men had always treated him. Only Justin had fucked him, and still he treated Adam as if he was his goal to treasure him. Treasured. That was what it tasted like, what was happening here from not only Justin but also Adam in return. Adam wasn't the type of person to only want something and not give it back. He'd made a point of being himself, of showing Justin how much he needed him, though he was holding his tongue, holding back what truly needed to be said. He was kissing Justin with emotion. with a hope and a prayer that the other guy would hear his pleas and would stay. Justin was kissing Adam as if he was something he wasn't quite sure he could keep, and yet he wanted to. Adam could feel it in the way one hand ran up his back, soft and gentle, with an edge of lust that wanted to take over everything. But unlike Adam, Justin hadn't lost his head. Adam swayed in joy. His mate, in front of everyone, was kissing him. He was being owned up front and with witnesses in a way he'd only ever dreamed of. And he was right there giving all that back. "We'll have to get the final word from Boss Man, but I think you're right," Craig said, his voice cutting through the lust as if he'd sprayed them with a hose. Justin pulled back from the kiss, licking his lips before looking over Adam's shoulder. "What? I think you're right. We should fight, but it's not our choice. We don't have the final say." "Who the fuck does then?" Justin asked. Something shifted, or maybe that had just been Craig, but it got Justin's attention, and even though he didn't take his hands off Adam, he turned his body, looking up towards the house. Adam looked too and saw Eamon standing there against the rail, strong, steady, a lion looking over his charges. Brad, Kyle, and Chris were leaning against the wood beside him, but they didn't demand notices, not like the boss. "In the house now," Eamon said, his words carrying across to them. It wasn't hard, and the way the land was set, he could have whispered his demand and the wind would have let them hear it. This was different. This was controlled anger, and it made Adam flinch as he linked his fingers with Justin's and quickly stepped to do as Eamon wanted. No thought, no hesitation. Eamon wanted them in the house, so they'd be there. Adam's heart beat a little faster, not liking the anger lining the boss words, especially when Eamon could have directed it at any one of them or all of them, or at Justin. Sucking in a sob, Adam tried hard to push that thought away. He loved his family, he loved his life here, and he didn't want to leave, but if Eamon kicked Justin out because of what had just happened, Adam would go too. He'd leave everything he owned and loved for Justin without a second thought. Maybe that should have scared him more.